On May 29, 1453, the sound of the world's largest cannon echoed across the waters separating Europe from Asia. With each deafening blast, 1,000 years of history crumbled into dust. This is the story of how one siege ended an empire that had survived since the age of Caesar, and changed the course of human civilization forever. Constantinople. For over a millennium, this city stood as the jewel of Christendom, the bridge between East and West, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of ancient Rome itself. Built on a peninsula where Europe meets Asia, protected by the sea on three sides and by the most formidable walls ever constructed on the fourth, it was considered virtually impregnable. The city's triple-layered walls had withstood 23 sieges. Arab armies had crashed against them. Barbarian hordes had been turned away. Even the mighty forces of Islam had failed to breach these defenses for 8 centuries. But by 1453, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former glory. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos ruled over an empire that existed mostly in memory. Where once Byzantine territory stretched from Spain to Syria, now only the city itself and a few scattered outposts remained. Constantinople's population had dwindled from 500,000 to fewer than 50,000 souls. The imperial treasury was empty. The emperor melted down church treasures just to pay his soldiers. But Constantine XI was no ordinary ruler. The last emperor of Rome bore the same name as the first Christian emperor who had founded this city 1100 years before. Perhaps it was destiny. Perhaps it was cruel irony. Constantine knew that his empire was dying, but he refused to let it die without honor. Across the Bosphorus, another young ruler dreamed very different dreams. Sultan Mehmed II was only 21 years old, but he had inherited an empire on the rise. The Ottoman Turks had been expanding for over a century, conquering the Balkans, Anatolia, and everything around Constantinople, everything except the city itself. Mehmed had been sultan before, briefly, as a child. His father had returned to reclaim the throne, dismissing his son as too young and impulsive. Now, back in power, Mehmed burned with ambition to prove himself. He had studied the city's defenses obsessively. He had read every account of previous sieges. And he had made a vow: Constantinople would fall, or he would die trying. The city that had withstood the test of time was now caught between an emperor with nothing left to lose and a sultan with everything to prove. What neither man fully understood was that this siege would not be decided by courage alone, but by a revolution in the technology of war. As winter gave way to spring in 1453, Ottoman forces began to gather outside Constantinople's walls. Inside the city, Constantine XI walked the ancient ramparts, knowing that the final chapter of Rome's thousand-year story was about to be written. The stage was set for one of history's most consequential battles, a siege that would slam shut the door on the Middle Ages and thrust the world into a new era. The question was no longer if Constantinople would fall, but when. And what would rise from its ashes. In the early months of 1453, the Ottoman army assembled like a gathering storm. From every corner of Mehmed's empire, soldiers marched toward Constantinople. Anatolian warriors, elite janissaries, European mercenaries, and irregular troops, over 80,000 men converged on the ancient city. The thunder of their drums could be heard from miles away. The dust from their march darkened the sky. But Mehmed's most fearsome weapon wasn't human. It was bronze, iron, and gunpowder, a revolution in warfare that would make even the mightiest stone walls obsolete. Enter Urban, a Hungarian engineer with a vision that would reshape warfare forever. He had first offered his services to Constantine, proposing to build the most powerful cannon ever created. But the Byzantine emperor's treasury was empty, he couldn't afford Urban's price. So the engineer crossed the Bosphorus and made the same offer to Mehmed. The young sultan's response was immediate: build me a cannon that can shatter the walls of Constantinople, and name your price. What Urban created defied imagination. The Basilica, as it came to be known, was a monster of metal, 27 feet long, weighing over 30,000 pounds. Its bronze mouth could swallow a man standing upright. The stone cannonballs it fired weighed over 1,200 pounds each. When test fired, the sound could be heard 10 miles away, and the ground shook like an earthquake. But the basilica came with a cost beyond gold. It required 200 men and 60 oxen just to move it. It took hours to load and cool between shots, and there was always the danger it might explode, killing its own crew. Yet Mehmed was willing to pay any price. He understood something that many military commanders of his era did not: the age of the impregnable fortress was ending. Inside Constantinople, reality set in with crushing weight. Constantine XI sent desperate pleas across Christian Europe. To Venice, to Genoa, to the Pope, to every Christian kingdom, he begged for reinforcements, for ships, for soldiers, for supplies. The response was devastating in its inadequacy. The Western Church sent Cardinal Isidore with 200 archers. A few hundred Genoese soldiers arrived under the command of Giovanni Giustiniani, a professional soldier who would prove worth 1,000 men. A handful of ships. A trickle of supplies. That was all. The bitter truth was that Western Europe had largely abandoned Constantinople. The great schism between Catholic and Orthodox churches had created a wound that wouldn't heal. Many in the West saw the Byzantines as schismatics, nearly as foreign as the Muslims themselves. Some even whispered that it would be better for Constantinople to fall than to compromise on matters of faith. Constantine faced an impossible calculation. To defend walls that stretched over 14 miles, he had fewer than 7,000 able-bodied men, soldiers, armed citizens, and foreign volunteers combined. Mehmed commanded over 80,000. The ratio was more than 10 to 1. But Giovanni Giustiniani brought more than soldiers, he brought expertise. This Genoese commander had defended cities before. He understood siege warfare, knew every trick attackers might employ. He immediately took charge of organizing the defense, dividing the walls into sectors, drilling the troops, stockpiling weapons and supplies at strategic points. Constantine gave Giustiniani command of the most vulnerable section, the Mesotichian, the middle wall in the valley where the land was flat and the defenses were oldest. If the walls were to break anywhere, it would be there. Giustiniani accepted without hesitation, though he knew he was being asked to stand at the point of the spear. As March turned to April, the noose tightened. Mehmed's fleet, over 300 ships, controlled the seas around Constantinople. The massive chain that the Byzantines had stretched across the Golden Horn, the inlet that protected the city's northern shore, kept the Ottoman navy out of that crucial waterway. But everywhere else, Turkish ships patrolled, cutting off any hope of reinforcement or escape by sea. On April 6, 1453, Mehmed gave the order. The basilica roared to life, hurling its massive stone projectiles against walls that had stood for 1,000 years. The siege of Constantinople had officially begun. Inside the city, Constantine XI gathered his commanders in the ancient church of Hagia Sophia. Beneath its soaring dome, where Byzantine emperors had been crowned for centuries, the last emperor of Rome made a simple vow: we will defend these walls with our lives. If God wills that this city should fall, then it will be over our corpses. But we will make them pay for every stone, every inch, every moment. We are the last of Rome. Let us die as Romans. The defenders took their positions. The Ottoman drums began their relentless rhythm. And the ancient world prepared to collide with the future in a battle that would echo through the centuries. The earth trembled. Day after day, night after night, Mehmed's cannons thundered against Constantinople's walls. The basilica and dozens of smaller guns maintained a relentless barrage that had never been seen in the history of warfare. Each impact sent shockwaves through the ancient stones. Each hit widened the cracks. The walls that had turned back armies for a millennium were being pulverized by the future. But the Byzantines refused to break. Every night, under cover of darkness, citizens and soldiers worked frantically to repair the damage. They filled the breaches with rubble, timber, anything they could find. Women and children hauled stones. Priests worked alongside laborers. Even nobles stripped off their silk robes and lifted debris with bleeding hands. By dawn, the walls stood again, battered, patched, but standing. Then the cannons would resume their terrible work. Mehmed wasn't content to rely on cannons alone. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers charged the walls, carrying scaling ladders, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. These assaults came without warning, sometimes at dawn, sometimes at midnight, designed to exhaust the defenders who never knew when the next attack would come. Giovanni Giustiniani seemed to be everywhere at once. When ladders appeared at one section, he was there, pushing them back. When Ottoman soldiers breached a barricade, he was there, sword in hand, driving them out. The Genoese commander became a legend among both defenders and attackers. Mehmed's soldiers began to fear the man in distinctive Italian armor who seemed impossible to kill. But courage couldn't hold back hunger. As April wore into May, supplies within Constantinople dwindled. The Ottoman blockade was complete. No ships could get through. Rations were cut, then cut again. Citizens boiled leather for soup. The wealthy opened their storehouses, sharing what little they had. Everyone understood, unless relief came soon, starvation would succeed where cannonballs had failed. In the palace, Constantine faced a terrible decision. His scouts reported no relief force coming from Europe. His treasury was empty. His soldiers were exhausted. Some advisors urged him to negotiate, perhaps Mehmed would accept tribute, would allow the emperor to retreat with honor. Constantine's response was firm: "I will not be the emperor who surrendered Constantinople. Our ancestors held this city against Persians, Arabs, and barbarians. We will not be the generation that failed them." But privately, the emperor knew the mathematics of survival. Each day, his forces grew weaker while Mehmed's remained strong. Each breach took longer to repair. Each assault cost lives he couldn't replace. Time itself had become the enemy's greatest weapon. Then, on April 22, Constantinople awoke to witness the impossible. Ottoman ships, dozens of them, were sailing inside the Golden Horn, the protected inlet that had been sealed off by the Great Chain. But they hadn't broken through the chain. They hadn't sailed around it. Mehmed had done something no one had thought possible: he had moved his ships over land. During the night, Ottoman engineers had constructed a greased wooden road over the hills behind the Genoese colony of Galata. 70 ships were pulled out of the Bosphorus, dragged over a mile of hilly terrain, and launched into the Golden Horn behind the chain. Sailors literally rowed their ships over mountains. The defenders stared in disbelief. It was engineering on a scale that seemed to defy nature itself. Suddenly, the northern walls, the weakest, least defended section because everyone thought the Golden Horn was secure, were under threat. Constantine had to split his already inadequate forces even thinner. The strategic situation had gone from desperate to catastrophic. Inside the city, the population turned to faith. Every church was packed day and night. People prayed before icons that had protected the city for centuries. Ancient relics were paraded through the streets. Prophecies were whispered. Some said Constantinople would never fall, that angels would descend to save the city at the last moment, just as they had in previous sieges. But there were darker whispers too. Strange omens appeared. A lunar eclipse turned the moon blood red. A holy icon being carried in procession slipped from its bearer's hands. 3 times they tried to lift it, and 3 times it fell. Fog rolled in so thick that it seemed supernatural. The superstitious saw the hand of God withdrawing his protection. Constantine walked among his people, trying to rally spirits, to kindle hope where despair threatened. He spoke of ancestors, of honor, of duty. He reminded them that they were Romans, heirs to an empire that had shaped the world. Better to die free than live as slaves. Yet even as he spoke these words, the emperor surely felt the weight of history crushing down upon him. He was not just defending a city, he was defending the last fragment of a civilization that stretched back to Augustus, to Julius Caesar, to the founding of the Republic itself. On his shoulders rested the survival of Rome. And Rome was dying. On the Ottoman side, Mehmed sensed victory approaching. His cannons had created multiple breaches in the walls. His ships controlled all waterways. His soldiers vastly outnumbered the defenders. But the siege had dragged on for weeks longer than he'd planned. His own advisors were growing restless. The longer this took, the more it looked like weakness. The Sultan made a calculated decision, one final, overwhelming assault. He would throw everything at Constantinople at once, his entire army, all his ships, every weapon and soldier at his command. Either the walls would break, or he would break himself trying. Mehmed set the date, May 29, 1453. The final battle for Constantinople, and for 1,000 years of history, was about to begin. May 28, 1453. The day before destiny. An eerie quiet settled over Constantinople. For the first time in weeks, the cannons fell silent. No attacks came. The Ottoman drums stopped their relentless rhythm. It was the silence before an earthquake, and everyone knew what it meant. Mehmed had given his army a day of rest. They prayed, sharpened their weapons, and prepared their souls. The Sultan rode through the camps, promising his soldiers the riches of the world's greatest city. Islamic law permitted 3 days of looting after a city was taken by storm. Constantinople's legendary treasures would be theirs: gold, jewels, silk, anything they could carry. And for those who died in battle, paradise awaited. Across the walls, Constantine gathered his defenders one final time. Greeks and Italians, Catholics and Orthodox, soldiers and civilians, they assembled in the church of Hagia Sophia for a final service. Ancient enemies prayed side by side. The theological disputes that had divided East and West for centuries seemed suddenly meaningless in the face of annihilation. Constantine stood before them, no longer an emperor but a man facing death alongside his people. His voice echoed beneath the great dome as he spoke words that would be remembered forever. "Gentlemen, illustrious captains of the army, and our brothers, you know well that this city is in grave danger. You know that our impious and cruel enemy is about to launch his final assault. Stand firm, therefore. Fight bravely and worthily, as you have done from the beginning, for the defense of your country, your families, and the Orthodox faith." He paused, looking at the faces before him, faces that showed fear, yes, but also resolve. "As for me, I shall die here with you. Better to die in battle than to live to see the fall of this city and the desecration of our faith." There were no more words to say. The defenders embraced each other, knowing many would not see another sunset. Catholics and Orthodox priests gave blessings together. Enemies became brothers. In the flickering candlelight of humanity's oldest cathedral, the last Romans prepared to meet their fate. As darkness fell, the defenders took their positions on the walls. Constantine assigned himself to the most dangerous section, the Mesotekion, where the walls were most damaged, where the main assault would surely come. If Constantinople was to fall, its emperor would fall defending it. At 1:30 in the morning of May 29, hell descended upon Constantinople. The Ottoman attack began with a sound that shattered the night: drums, cymbals, horns, and the war cries of 80,000 men launching themselves at the walls simultaneously. This wasn't a probing attack or a limited assault. This was total war, everything Mehmed possessed thrown at the city in one apocalyptic wave. First came the Bashi bazooks, irregular troops, poorly armed but numerous as stars. They were expendable, meant to exhaust the defenders and fill the moats with their bodies if necessary. They swarmed the walls with ladders, and the Byzantines cut them down by the hundreds. But for every man who fell, 2 more appeared. The defenders' arms grew heavy with killing. For 2 hours, the Bashi bazooks hurled themselves at the walls. Then, just as the defenders thought they might hold, the second wave struck. The Anatolian regulars, professional soldiers, well-armed and disciplined. They came in organized units, exploiting weaknesses, targeting the damaged sections. The fighting grew more intense, more desperate. Men grappled hand-to-hand on the battlements. Blood made the stones slippery. Then disaster struck. Giovanni Giustiniani, the man who had held the defenses together through sheer will, was hit by a projectile that pierced his armor. The wound was serious, perhaps mortal. The Genoese commander, who had shown no fear throughout the entire siege, was carried from the walls toward a ship in the harbor, seeking medical treatment. His departure broke something in the defenders' spirit. The man they thought invincible was bleeding, retreating. Panic rippled through the Byzantine lines. Constantine himself rushed to the breach, trying to rally the troops, trying to fill the void left by Giustiniani. But the damage was done. The Ottomans sensed the shift. The third wave, the Janissaries, Mehmed's elite troops, advanced. These were the Sultan's finest soldiers, fanatically loyal, superbly trained. They wore distinctive white caps and carried the best weapons. They never retreated. They never broke. And they came straight for the Mesotikion, where the walls were most damaged and the defenders most shaken. At that moment, fate intervened in the form of a forgotten door. The Kirkaporta, a small military gate in the inner wall, used by defenders to launch counterattacks, had been left unlocked in the chaos of battle. Some say it was an accident. Some say it was exhaustion. Some say it was God's will. But 50 Ottoman soldiers found it, pushed through, and suddenly they were inside the walls. 50 men shouldn't have mattered. But they raised their banners on the battlements, and to attackers and defenders alike, it looked like the walls had been breached. The psychological impact was devastating. Constantine saw the Ottoman banners flying from his own walls. He knew what it meant. The emperor drew his sword and charged toward the breach, shouting to anyone who would follow, "The city is fallen, but I still live." He plunged into the melee around the gate. A handful of loyal soldiers followed him. They were swallowed by the Ottoman tide. No one knows exactly how Constantine XI died. Some say he was cut down fighting at the gate. Some say he tore off his imperial regalia so he could die as a common soldier rather than be captured. His body was never definitively identified, though the Ottomans later claimed to have found it among piles of dead. What is certain is this: the last emperor of Rome died as he had vowed, sword in hand, defending his city to the final breath. The line of emperors that stretched back to Augustus ended not with surrender, but with blood and defiance. As dawn broke on May 29, 1453, Ottoman soldiers poured through multiple breaches in the walls. The defenses collapsed. What followed was the darkest chapter of this dark day, 3 days of looting, as Islamic law permitted. Churches were desecrated. Citizens were killed or enslaved. Treasures accumulated over 1,000 years were scattered to the winds. The Byzantine Empire, the last living connection to the ancient Roman world, ceased to exist. On the afternoon of May 29, Sultan Mehmed II rode through the shattered gates of Constantinople as a conqueror. He was 21 years old, and he had achieved what sultans, caliphs, and generals had attempted for 8 centuries. He had taken the city that could not be taken. But what he found inside sobered even him. The streets ran with blood. Buildings smoldered. Bodies lay everywhere. The 3 days of looting he had promised his soldiers were brutal beyond imagination. Thousands of citizens had been killed. Thousands more were chained together, destined for slave markets across the Islamic world. The city that had been the jewel of civilization was being torn apart. Mehmed rode to the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had been the heart of Orthodox Christianity for 900 years. He dismounted and entered the vast space beneath its soaring dome. A soldier was breaking up the marble floor for loot. The Sultan struck him down, declaring that the buildings were his by right of conquest, only people and movable goods could be plundered. Then Mehmed did something that surprised many. He ordered that the Hagia Sophia be converted into a mosque, but preserved. He recognized that Constantinople's greatness lay not just in conquest, but in what it represented, 1,000 years of accumulated civilization, knowledge, and culture. The Sultan declared himself Caesar of Rome, Kaiser-i Rum in Turkish. He wasn't just a conqueror, he saw himself as the rightful heir to the Roman Empire. Constantinople was renamed Constantini, and later, Istanbul. It would become the capital of the Ottoman Empire, a position it would hold for nearly 5 centuries. Mehmed invited Greek scholars, artisans, and merchants to return to the city. He granted protected status to the Orthodox Church and appointed a new patriarch. He wanted Constantinople to regain its glory, but as an Ottoman city, a Muslim city, a new synthesis of East and West. Yet for all Mehmed's vision, something irreplaceable had been lost. The last living link to the ancient world had been severed. The empire that Constantine the Great had founded, that had preserved Greek and Roman learning through the Dark Ages, that had been the bulwark of Christendom, it was gone forever. But from catastrophe came unexpected transformation. In the months and years after the fall, thousands of Byzantine scholars fled westward, carrying with them the treasures of their libraries, ancient Greek texts, Roman histories, philosophical works that had been preserved in Constantinople for centuries. They scattered across Italy, settling in Venice, Florence, Rome. They brought manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, Homer, Herodotus, works that had been largely unknown in Western Europe. They brought knowledge of Greek language and ancient philosophy. This influx of Byzantine scholars and classical texts acted like gasoline on the smoldering embers of the Italian Renaissance. The revival of classical learning that had been slowly building in Italy suddenly exploded. Universities expanded their curricula. Artists studied classical forms. Philosophers rediscovered ancient wisdom. In a very real sense, the fall of Constantinople helped launch the Renaissance into its greatest phase. The Greek East and Latin West, divided for centuries by theology and politics, were reunited through catastrophe. The ancient world's knowledge, preserved in Byzantine libraries, flowed into Europe precisely when Europe was ready to receive. The fall had another profound consequence, one that would reshape the entire world. For centuries, Constantinople had been the gateway between Europe and Asia, the hub of the Silk Road trade. European merchants had grown rich importing spices, silk, and luxury goods from the east through Byzantine intermediaries. Now that gateway was in Ottoman hands, and the Ottomans controlled the trade routes. This forced European powers to seek alternatives. If they couldn't trade through Constantinople, they would have to find another route to the Indies. Portuguese sailors began exploring down the coast of Africa, seeking a sea route around the continent. Spanish monarchs funded expeditions westward across the Atlantic. In 1492, just 39 years after Constantinople fell, Christopher Columbus sailed west trying to reach Asia and stumbled upon the Americas instead. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded Africa and reached India by sea. The age of exploration, which would lead to European colonization of the Americas and the creation of the modern global economy, was directly triggered by the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. The siege that ended the Byzantine Empire inadvertently launched European expansion across the globe. History's great turning points rarely happen in isolation, they cascade forward in ways no one can predict. But perhaps the most profound legacy of 1453 was symbolic. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had represented continuity, the unbroken line connecting the ancient world to the medieval one. Its fall marked a psychological break point that contemporaries recognized immediately. The Middle Ages, defined by feudalism, religious authority, and continuity with the classical past, were ending. A new era was beginning, one characterized by nation-states, gunpowder warfare, global exploration, and the questioning of old certainties. Historians would later call it the birth of the modern world. The siege also revolutionized military thinking. Constantinople's walls had been the standard by which all fortifications were measured. If they could fall to cannon fire, then nowhere was safe. This triggered a revolution in military architecture, the star forts and angled bastions of the gunpowder age, designed to deflect cannonballs rather than simply absorb them. Warfare itself changed. The feudal knight became obsolete. Gunpowder, cannons, and organized infantry became supreme. The siege of Constantinople demonstrated that technology and engineering could overcome any defense. The future belonged not to those with the strongest walls, but to those with the most advanced weapons. Today, Istanbul stands as one of the world's great cities, a bridge between continents and cultures, home to over 15 million people. The Hagia Sophia, converted back to a mosque in 2020 after decades as a museum, still stands with its magnificent dome, a testament to Byzantine engineering and Ottoman preservation. Visitors can still walk sections of the Theodosian walls, can still see the marks where cannonballs struck. The Golden Horn still glitters in the sunlight. The Bosphorus still separates Europe from Asia. But the empire that defended these waters for a millennium exists only in history. Constantine XI was never found, never buried with imperial honors. But legends grew around the last emperor. Greek folklore speaks of the marble emperor. Constantine turned to marble, sleeping beneath the Golden Gate, waiting to awaken when Constantinople is restored to Christian hands. It's a legend born of grief and loss, the refusal to accept that something so ancient and magnificent could truly end. But end it did. On May 29, 1453, the Byzantine Empire fell. Rome, which had been founded according to legend in 753 BC, which had conquered the Mediterranean, which had survived barbarian invasions and religious schisms, which had evolved into the Byzantine Empire and endured for another 1,000 years, finally, irrevocably, came to an end. Yet in ending, it transformed the world. The scholars it sent westward helped ignite the Renaissance. The trade routes it closed forced the age of exploration. The military technology that destroyed it revolutionized warfare. The psychological break it represented helped Europe transition from medieval to modern. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of an empire. It was the hinge upon which history turned, the moment when one age died and another was born. Every time we study classical philosophy, every time we trace the routes of global trade, every time we examine the rise of the modern world, we are looking at ripples that spread from that single siege in 1453. Some endings are also beginnings. Some falls are also transformations. And some defeats echo through history not as endings, but as the thunder that announces a new age being born. Constantinople fell. But the world it created, our world, rose from its ashes.